Hello, welcome to PCAP's Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Rose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. This week, PCAP is hosting a series of webinars about the ecological goods and services provided by the native prairie ecosystem. Tomorrow, Rhonda King with Alice Canada will be presenting about Beyond Conservation to Production. On Friday, Dr. Frank Mitloner will be speaking about the truth of cattle and methane emissions. And we have another webinar on Friday about prairie butterflies by Medea Courtney with Environment and Climate Change Canada. So check out the PCAP website for information or to register for upcoming webinars. And all past presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel. Today, Graham Parsons with Saskatchewan Agriculture will be speaking about pollinators in his presentation, Beyond the Bee's Tongue. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Sask Energy and Wildlife Habitat Canada, as well as our supporting sponsors, Eco-Friendly Sask, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, Inc., and Environment and Climate Change Canada. In-kind support for today's webinar has been given by Saskatchewan Agriculture. And just a note to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Now a bit about today's presenter. Graham was introduced to honeybees early as the son of a commercial beekeeper. Besides spending his summers beekeeping in Saskatchewan, he spent 7 months beekeeping in New Zealand after graduation. With an interest in nature and the outdoors, Graham took a diploma in integrated resource management from SIAS, now Sask Polytechnic, and spent 4 years doing environmental consulting covering soils, plants, and wildlife surveys in Saskatchewan and Western Canada, including soil surveys to wolverine tracking in the Arctic. Graham went back to school at the U of S and received a degree in renewable resource management, then did a master's degree at the University of Manitoba while doing honeybee research for the Saskatchewan Beekeepers Development Commission. Graham has worked for Saskatchewan Agriculture since 2016, and when not working, his time is spent outdoors cycling, or with his family, cycling and photography and doing family activities. And I'm also very grateful for Graham doing the webinar today because he has a new baby that just is a few days old. So we really appreciate Graham taking the time to come out and do the webinar today. So with that, I'll pass it over to Graham.
All right. Hello, everyone. Sorry, my first webinar, so we'll kind of get up and running here and we'll get things going. So my presentation here today is Beyond the Bee's Tongue, and we'll just swap these here. So today we're going to talk about a little bit most people when they think about bees, think about honeybees, but we're going to think maybe beyond the honeybee and think of the other bees besides honeybees, but also thinking beyond the tip or the end of the bee's tongue. So at the end where they're collecting the nectar and doing all that sort of fun stuff that makes bees very important. So their pollination aspects as well. So the first thing we want to ask or thinking about for bees is, what is pollination? So pollination, it's all about plant sex. So we have here a picture of beetles having sex in a flower having sex. So this is a kind of a crazy wild world of pollination. So much like humans in our stuff, when we go out, we're looking for dates and things. There's flashy colors, there's perfumes, cheating, rewards, compatibility, hermaphrodites, etc. So pollination is a very wild world, and that's kind of where I work and where we'll kind of chat about a little bit today. So viewer discretion is advised. We'll have graphic images of plant sex here today. So again, simplified plant sex here, nothing too complicated. There's a lot of sophistication to it, but generally we'll just say small male sex cells have to meet large female sex cells. So usually that's the pollen from the stamens meets the ovules in the ovaries. So this fertilization results in seeds or fruit. So there's different matchmakers can make this happen. In this case, there's a bumblebee there on the right. And the flowers can offer rewards to make this matchmaking happen. So make sure that those pollinators are attracted to flowers. So we can see in this bumblebee, she's got her face in that flower. She's got fuzzy hairs on her head. They're getting in touch with that those stamens, getting that pollen, and then transferring it to other parts of the flower, the the other parts of the flower there that result in pollination, and that will result in seed or fruit for that plant, in this case, the hascap. We'll have a little example or more explanation of that plant, particularly a little bit later too. So we can talk about our matchmakers. We have kind of many broad categories of pollinators. So we'll start with anemophily, hydrophily, and zoophily. So wind, water, and insects are animals generally. So from our animals, we go to more specifically, there's birds, bats, slugs, insects, lizards, mammals, etc. Basically, lots of different animals can do pollination. So in some places, there's bats you're pollinating, other places, birds, etc. For us here, mostly in Saskatchewan, most of our pollination would be entomophily, so insect pollination, and then you can break that out further into butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, and bees. So what we're probably going to talk most about today is our bees would be melitophily, so melito meaning bees there. So broad to specific. So and then our pollinating agents can also predict our flower type, and our flower type can predict the pollinating agent based on the shape or the structure of the different pollinator or the flower. So if we think of this this system of pollinators and flowers working together, there's a pretty maybe famous example or a good example is Charles Darwin found an orchid with a very long nectar spur. So this orchid from Madagascar, long nectar spur, and predicted there would be a pollinator to match this this flower. They weren't able to find it until some 20 years later, and there was a moth with a very, very long proboscis pictured there that can see is getting all that, the nectar spur goes right off into the bottom there, can collect the nectar, resulting in pollination of that flower. So that the moth is going to touch parts of that flower, collect the nectar, and then take it back, so it needs a reward. So the name for this moth, Xanthopan morgani predicta, the predicted one was based on Darwin's observations that these two would probably evolve together. So that is kind of an exotic example, but something maybe a little bit closer to home in southern prairies of Manitoba. There's a western prairie fringed orchid, and there's moths there. So the flower is very specialized. You can see there's two red arrows there on the white flower. There's two pollen or pollinia that are shaped there, and they're specific width. That same width you'll see on the moth pictured there. So the flower is shaped in such a way so that the moth has to line up specifically there, put its tongue in the hole, and get to the bottom of the nectar spur to get its reward. When the moth does that, those pollinia attach to the moth's eyes. It takes off. It goes to the next flower, transfers that pollen from one flower to another, gets its reward, and away it goes. So those kind of exotic examples are very specialized examples, are not just other places, they do happen here closer to home too as well. We think of other things, so if we look at something like these grasses here, we have very abundant pollen, we have very small pollen, maybe open flowers, a simple flower, there's no nectar, and very little nutrition in that pollen because it is so small, even microscopic or dust size. There we would think, well, what would be the pollinator for this? Well, of course, it's wind. Most of our grasses, or all of our grasses, are wind pollinated. So all of our grasses don't really need pollination. So a common question I get is, or you maybe see in the public eye, is would we die without pollinators? And the answer is probably not. So most of our diets, probably 90% or more, come from a few different species: rice, wheat, sorghum, millet, rye, barley, etc. So a lot of these are either wind or self-pollinated. But if we think of what our diet would be with only those plants, it'd be very bland, and probably we'd be a little bit low on our nutritional microcomponents, so some of those vitamins and minerals and things. So we'd get the calories and protein we need, but not the other stuff that might be important. So it'd be a little bit more difficult to do that without our pollination. So we could survive, but our diets would be probably very boring. So for us in Saskatchewan here, my one crappy joke for the presentation, wind pollination basically guaranteed in Saskatchewan because Alberta blows and Manitoba sucks. So anyway, pause for laughs. Anyway, so the different pollinating insects we have different preferences and different efficacies. So if you look at something like butterflies, so if you've ever watched a butterfly forage on flowers, it's kind of a single adult, and they'll just kind of flutter from place to place with not really a whole lot of direction or rush to them. They're going from a single flower, and they're just usually collecting nectar. As adults, they're just collecting nectar and not much else to feed. Look at beetles too. They can go to different flowers and things. They're often mating in flowers, so not specifically looking to pollinate. And then we have wasps, flies, and bees. So based on their foraging behavior, so something like the butterflies going from place to place without a whole lot of drive would be maybe less effective. But something like a bee is looking specifically to collect pollen to feed to their larvae. So because of that life cycle, so the immature bees are fed pollen, they need to collect lots of pollen. So they've got morphology to make sure that that's happening. And then also their species number. So there's lots and lots of species of bees specifically adapted to collecting pollen. And a lot of bee species individually have lots of numbers in their colonies. So a bumblebee colony, for instance, may have at the peak of the season 60 or 70 individuals, whereas something like a butterfly might be just 1 or 2 here and there, right? So lots of different opportunity there. So we look at some of the different morphological adaptations. There's pictures of a honeybee in the top right and a wasp in the bottom left. And then a fly, maybe for an example. So flies can do pollination. They can be relatively important pollinators, but they're not the most effective. So the fly relative to the bee is less fuzzy, so less opportunity for those hairs to stick on. The beetle, well, that one is fairly fuzzy. It's a scarab beetle and a rose flower. They're not specifically adapted for collecting pollen, and they don't fly as strongly or as well as bees, so they're not able to move from more flowers or hit as many flowers in as short a time, so they're usually resulting in less pollination as bees would be. The difference, a big difference between honeybees and wasps there in the bottom. Wasp is a predator. They plant meat. They're feeding that to insect meat. They're feeding to their larvae. As adults, they just are going to flowers and collecting nectar just to fuel themselves, not specifically collecting pollen. And a honeybee, they're different. They're basically vegetarian wasps, quite evolved from that, but that's the basic of them. And they have their hairs are actually branched like the feather there. So you see that's a microscopic view of a bee's hair, so that those individual fuzzy hairs able to allow them to collect more pollen when they're flying, sticks to those hairs, and they can brush that off and sweep that off and take it to different places in their hive. So for bees, generally most effective based on that foraging behavior, they're going specifically to flowers to collect nectar and pollen. They have their life cycle. They are feeding their young pollen, so they need to collect that pollen in order to feed them. And they're collecting that nectar often to feed themselves, fuel themselves, but also mix that and feed for fuel as their larvae too. They have their morphology. Probably the most important adaptation for bees is they're pollen collection experts. So you see here there's kind of a collection of bees. There's the honeybee, again, the top right. There's a leafcutter bee, bumblebee, bottom left, and a few other bees in the middle there too. So they've got, you see the leafcutter bee in the bottom right. She's got a bristly group of hairs on her abdomen called the scopa, specifically adapted to collect pollen. That bumblebee in the bottom left, she's got fuzzy hairs you can see on her face. Those hairs are designed to collect that pollen. She actually sweep that off, collect it into a pollen ball, and put it into a little packet on her leg. Again, our honeybee, similar to the bumblebee, has got those fuzzy hairs. Those hairs will collect the pollen. She could actually sweep that off, collect it into her pollen basket on her back leg. We call that a corbicula, if you want to get technical. So she'll sweep that into that basket and then haul it back to the honeybee colony too. So think of our bees. We think a lot of people first think of a bee as honeybees. So very common pollinator for people to think of and see, and it's one that I'm very familiar with, but there's lots of other bees. So a little bit of what you'd see for a honeybee is there's lots of individuals. Typically any individual colony would be at the peak of the season up to say 60,000 or maybe even more. This time of year in say the winter here in Saskatchewan, we might be about 20,000 or so, 2 kilograms or maybe 1.5 kilograms or thereabouts. They exhibit something called floral constancy. So over the course of a day, an individual bee will probably try to stay with the same flower. So she's taking pollen from the same species to the next individual of the same species and transferring that pollen. So very effective for pollination that way. The colonies are perennial, so they're lasting multiple years, so that those bees are available. You can have them and keep them and continue to grow them too as well, and able to keep them easier that way. So make management quite a bit easier. They're strong flyers. They fly very easily up to 3 kilometers and can go quite a bit farther if there's nothing. Reports up to 12 kilometers too, typically less, but 3 kilometers is a good rule for them. They're social, again, many individuals, lots of numbers. They'll nest in cavities, which for us makes things easy because we can put them in a box, lift up the box, take them somewhere else. So their management is easy that way. And they're excellent generalist pollinators because they have a good tongue length, or that proboscis. They're able to access lots of different flowers. They're reasonably fuzzy. There's lots of them around. So they're just really the best kind of go-to do-it-all pollinator for most things, but there's some applications where they're not perfect too. But when you think of honeybees, actually they're very different from most bees. Actually, the thing that makes honeybees so good as pollinators is probably very different from everything else. So if we look at our honeybees, almost everything is different about them. So most of our bees are honeybee, which is introduced from Asia, Europe, or Africa. So they're not native to North America. They're nesting in hives. They're social, again, many individuals and multiple generations in one spot at once. Perennial, lasting multiple years. They can forage for a long time, so a long time within the season. So from spring till fall. So maybe here in Saskatchewan would be, say, April and May all the way into October, so lasting a long time. They do need lots of forage, so there's lots of individuals there, and lots of individuals need lots of food, so they take quite a bit of forage to keep them running. They can store excess for scarcity. That's, for us as beekeepers, what we capitalize on. So their instinct is to hoard that nectar because they are surviving in a season where there is no nectar. They have to store it up or put it in the pantry for later. So that's where they're collecting nectar and creating honey. They store that. As beekeepers, we can take that, supplement them something back, keep them fed and warm for winter. But because of that instinct, we can collect that. Foraging, very easy, 3 kilometers, and they're generalists. So our wild bees, basically almost opposite for everything. So they're mostly nesting in the ground or in the soil, some about 70% in the ground, 30% woody material. They're solitary, which is an individual queen would hatch in the year, and she would start her own colony. She'd be mated with a male, or maybe mated the season before, depending on their biology, on the individual bee, and starting her own colony, lasting usually one season, foraging for a short time. So whenever she would emerge, that individual female, she probably needs resources right away. So she comes out at a time where her flowers aren't available. She might be without stores to survive and might be without it. So a small patch can make a lot of difference for individuals because 1 or 2 bees, some of the smaller bees might be as small as 2 or 3 millimeters, or just a small fly type size. A patch of flowers as big as your kitchen table might be all they need too. Foraging generally short distances, 50 to 200 meters commonly, and they can be generalists to specialists. So looking at some of our bees here in Saskatchewan, a poster I have up in my office is from the backyard bees of North America. So what people often think about, they might have seen honeybees. They're circled in the kind of the middle, a group of bumblebees, and you might have heard also leafcutter bees, one there in the bottom right circled. But here in Saskatchewan, we've got up to about 386 species that we know in the prairie ecoregion. So quite a lot of species, more than most people kind of think of or see. So lots of individuals there, and you can see just the variation. So that poster is actually the difference in size relative to all of them. So some of them are very small and some of them very large. So that gives them different capabilities too. So again, not all bees are the same: solitary, social, annual versus perennial, small and large, their forage distance, their pollen carrying ability. So you look at that, the honeybee in the top right corner, you can see on her back leg, she's got her pollen baskets full, so she's carrying it there too. Our bumblebee in the same family, Apidae, is carrying her pollen, so just the one below there in the middle on the right. You can see a little patch of pollen on her leg. And then a small solitary bee has got a little pollen on her leg too, but then our leafcutter bee in the bottom left has got that scopa too. So, and again, generalists and specialists. So we look at a fairly common group that a lot of people are pretty familiar with, our bumblebees here in Saskatchewan. We have about 20 species. They're most like our honeybees in that they're social, very good foraging, but they're still different in that they're only lasting one season. So they would start from a overwintered queen in the winter. She would go out and mate. She'd have mated in the fall previous. She'd overwinter. She'd emerge in that season, and then she'd start her colony from zero that year. They'd grow, produce reproductives, and then start the cycle again. And then some of the examples of our native honeybees would often be pollinating. So they're well adapted, or they're specifically adapted or evolved with our native vetches. So there in the bottom middle is American vetch. So the bumblebee, you can see she's got a very long tongue. It's sticking out there, enables her to get to the bottom of that flower, get the nectar. Her face, or the fuzzy hair on the front of her head, is going to collect that pollen, transfer it to the next one. So those bumblebees, with that shape and that structure, are actually very good for a lot of our introduced forages. So our bird's foot trefoil, milk vetches, sainfoin, alfalfa, and all sorts of clovers. So if you look at the kind of the shape and the structure of all those flowers, generally, they're kind of the same. So bumblebees, that pollination syndrome, where you see their shape, or their shape of the bee kind of dictates or allows you to predict what sort of flower they would be foraging on. So all those flowers generally have a longer corolla or floral tube that bee is well adapted to get access to. Another thing, I'll just show the video here, and we tried it, but we weren't able to get the volume to come through. This is just a video of bumblebee buzz pollination. And here, maybe it's not going to work for me either. Oh, it's not working for me either. So I'll maybe just wait. My computer's not responding, but I'll just explain the video. Is a bumblebee has a unique ability to do something called buzz pollination. So when a bumblebee goes to a flower, so in this case a rose, there's some flowers where they need to shake the pollen loose with vibration. So a bumblebee can actually uncouple the muscles from its flight muscles. So in the middle part of the body, the thorax, is all the flight muscles for the wings. Allows the bee to buzz. So the bees she'll be buzzing in this flower. You have the buzzing sound of the bee, but her wings aren't fluttering or moving at all. So that vibration knocks the pollen loose from the flower. It'll fall onto her. She'll collect it and move it on to the next flower, or in the individual flowers, that pollen will be shaken loose from one part and fall onto the female part in another and result in pollination. So very good for the flower that way. So again, our example of where maybe bumblebees might be better than maybe honeybees, or different or more effective, is a local example I have here in Saskatchewan. I went out to a haskap producer. He was on the forest fringe of Saskatchewan, and he had his local honeybee beekeeper had a pretty rough year, and the bees didn't really do well on his orchard, and didn't have a lot of bees to do the pollination. So he wondered if he was going to get good pollination for his haskaps. So haskap is a native fruit here. We've now got orchards and stuff in different places in Saskatchewan where it absolutely needs insect pollination. It's self-incompatible, which means the pollen from one individual cannot pollinate its own flower. It must get pollen from another slightly different would say race or different cultivar of haskaps. So they must transfer it from row to row to row. So the bumblebee is a kind of the weapon of choice for that, because she's foraging at the time of year when they're effective. So these haskaps are blooming kind of early in the spring, so where it kind of can be often very cold, down to 0 degrees Celsius and up to kind of 5 and 10 and 15. But that's a temperature where honeybees are actually, they're not as tough or as hardy as the bumblebee is. So it's a little bit too cold, a little bit too maybe windy for them, but the bumblebee actually does very well. So in this orchard, I went out and had a look and came around, and he had bumblebees were kind of all over the place, and he actually gets fantastic fruit set. So if you look there in the picture, there's some different fruit of the haskap. So the two different corolla tubes of the haskap, there's two different flowers side by side. If you look in the top right corner there, those two flowers join at the little fruit and have to have pollination of both sides of those flowers. And actually the fruit has kind of 3 times the skin of anything else. So the two flowers get pollinated, and then the kind of case goes around them. So you've got kind of 3 layers of skin. You see there, the one with the been improperly pollinated or poorly pollinated, not fully closed up. So to get really good pollination results in really high quality fruit there too. So again, an example where bumblebees are probably the best or most well adapted for that sort of application. Again, I also get examples because people wonder about what are those huts out in alfalfa fields? Those actually aren't honeybees at all. Those are a different bee altogether. So that's alfalfa leaf cutting bee. Again, they're introduced from kind of the Middle East or so, where alfalfa comes from, and they're specifically adapted for that flower. So if we look at that flower, this is a alfalfa flower there on the right, and then the leaf cutter there on the bottom are, pardon me, the flower on the left and the leaf cutter on the bottom right. You see that leaf cutter is quite a bit smaller than our honeybee in the top. So she's got, when that leaf cutter goes to the flower, she'll trip. So the one flower there is tripped and a couple of them aren't. So you see the stamens and things, usually they sit down in the bottom part of the flower. When the bee comes up, that the pressure of the bee actually results in that kind of releasing and kind of bumping in the other side of the leaf cutter bee. So that happens for the leaf cutter that transmits the pollen to the leaf cutter, and she'll result in pollination. For honeybees, they don't actually like that. They kind of get bunted on the underside of the chin because they're a little bit bigger. They don't really like it. So that actually that honeybee, she's gone to the side now, so she doesn't get hit in the head. She can collect the nectar, but actually she's cheating, or she's getting the reward from that flower without resulting in pollination. So that's why we use leafcutter bees, or a specific bee for that flower, to result in the best pollination. So honeybees can result in some additional seed set, but not a whole lot. So because of that kind of cheating behavior for them. Look at another example people might be familiar with. So there's a couple of photos here of honeybee on canola flower. So if you look at the photos there's kind of a few different things going on where there's one bee is doing what she should be, and there's a couple other bees that are kind of cheating flower. So if you look at this flower, different bees, and a common misconception people have is that bees instinctually know how to work every individual flower. The truth is they don't. They actually have to learn every flower as they go. There's a few different cues they use to figure them out. So there can be color cues, or different change or lines, shape, color, smell, scent, and work their way in. So some bees, so this, the bee on the left, she's actually a nectar and pollen forager. So you can see her pollen basket is full, but actually she's got her face on the part of the flower that matters. So when she gets the nectar, you can see a small little drop of nectar there in the bottom of that canola flower. She's going to collect that, but as she reaches her head into the bottom there, her face and that hairy face is going to collect some of that pollen and transfer it from flower to flower. So those other two bees there on the right, they're actually nectar thieves. They're collecting nectar, but they're not pollinating. You see their face or their fuzzy parts are not touching the part of the flower that would result in pollination. So they might shake some pollen loose and result in pollination, but in this case, they're not specifically transferring pollen from flower to flower themselves. So they might be nectar foragers only, or they might be nectar and pollen foragers, different bees there. You might think, oh, the introduced honeybee is a cheater because they're not native here. Well, there's actually native bees here in Saskatchewan that are pollen cheaters too. This bee probably didn't chew these holes, but there are some species of bumblebees. They have a short tongue, a short face. They can't actually get to the bottom of the flower, so they might chew a hole on the side there. So pollination biology is an arms race, so the flowers have to figure out a way to get around that sometimes too, and native bees can cheat on that as well. So again, that pollination biology can be an arms race. Again, so there's in some places, so just a clipping from a study, moths and bees are stealing nectar from a rare orchid. This is again that western prairie fringed orchid. You can see that long nectar spur there for the flowers. Well, if you can bypass that, you can get to the nectar there at the bottom and collect the nectar without pollinating the flower. So pollination biology, always an arms race for everybody involved too. So our native grasslands allow that those kind of specialized niches to get those specialized pollinators for that to happen. So having those around allow those special pollinators and plants to kind of continue as well. So again, just some examples of bees doing the work that might help other people or help different fruits and things. So bees are converting strawberries to strawberry fruit. And again, our wild roses, a wild bee there pollinating that wild rose. Those wild rose seeds would be collected by Lots of different birds eat them. People can collect them, collect the rose hips. So that's food for lots of different people or different organisms in the ecosystem. But then also helping that plant to produce that seed and get it out there too as well. So kind of a big cog. Again, another example are bumblebees. So they're foraging on a current. So the bee there, she's got her long tongue out. She can get to the bottom of that nectar spur, and this currant flower can get that, transferring pollen from one place to another. And of course, that bee pollination results in our fruits there too as well. So those currants and things. The other place, if you think for bees helping out other people in the ecosystem or doing a service, would be our blueberries. So blueberries are commonly or probably best pollinated by bumblebees. Other bees will pollinate too as well, honeybees and a few others pollinating, but our bumblebees will be pollinating, creating lots of fruit. And then somebody down the line, maybe bear later in the season, would be collecting that fruit, and they need that. So if you think of in the whole season, if we had a time of year where the weather is poor for bees, actually poor foraging weather, it could have been a great year otherwise for the blueberries, but because there's poor foraging weather for bees, there might be bears or somebody else down the line that is without that food. So kind of a knock-on effect of having poor pollination might be lots of other wildlife without the resources kind of they need. Again, other examples here, bumblebees onto lingonberries or ligonberries, feeding our cedar waxwings and things. So lots of wildlife needing that. You think of, fruit set and seed set is important, but there's other parts of the flower that are important too. So here an example, our fireweed produces a very, very tiny small seed. It's almost like a grain of dust, but the seed is attached to a little piece of a down or fuzz that allows them to be transferred on the wind. So these seeds often sit kind of in the fireweed stalk over the winter. They'd be there in the spring. So something like this leaf flycatcher could come along, collect that, build it into a nice fuzzy nest. So not just the seeds and the fruits, but there's other parts of the flower that would be important from that pollination. Again, just another example. This is not a native plant, but introduced one. So this Canada thistle, I'm sure the bumblebee was happy to have the forage, and the mouse was probably happy to have not only the seeds from that, but also the down from that to line her nest. So her young would have that. Again, another thing, lots of insects get eaten by birds too. So having those pollinators around allows them to it's not in the interest of the bee, but really helps out other organisms there in the environment. So there's some places where there's specifically birds that are adapted. So in Australia, rainbow bee eater, they're specifically collecting bees and eating them. So there's some different place for pollinators everywhere. So if we look at bees kind of generally, there's lots of different things that would help our bees. So, but they all need basically the same thing. So a place to live and eat, a place to overwinter, and a place to raise their young. So if we kind of couple that all together, that is basically habitat, right? So bees need habitat in order to live. So we look at some of the research. So researchers have found a link between landscape diversity, species richness, and the abundance of wild pollinators in ecosystems. This is likely because many crops, such as canola, do not provide adequate pollen and nectar resources for pollination in their lifespans longer than the blooms. So if we look at maybe an example from Saskatchewan, so this is maybe a Google Earth image of a place just north of Regina, town for us, where there's lots of canola pollination, or canola production. So here, just kind of canola from place to place. If we look at this in terms of bee habitat, it's very good for a short time while the canola blooms, but look at it more broadly. So while our canola blooms, canola has got lots of nectar and high quality pollen for bees, but that canola only blooms for generally kind of 2 or 3 weeks. If there's nothing there, there's cultivation from edge to edge in there. There's very good weed control. There's very little ditch space and 100% cultivation. So we know our bees are nesting in the ground and in woody stems. So if we're cultivating the ground, those bees' nests are going to be impacted. There's very little species diversity. The floral duration is relatively short in that case, or there's not a lot of opportunity for different species. And our bees would be flying 200 meters or less, most of our wild bees. So each one of those squares is generally a half a mile or 800 meters. So if they're cultivated from edge to edge, bees might be living in the ditch or the field margins, wintering there, but they're probably not going to fly all the way to the middle. So the middle of those fields might be losing some pollination ability because those bees are not going all the way there to get that pollination done. So if we look at that, there's an opportunity in some of those spaces to add some habitat to provide more pollination for that landscape. So just, this is again a Google Earth image from a different spot, kind of 10 kilometers away from the previous one, more landscape complexity, right? So if we look at, again, those squares, 800 meters or so, in each one of those squares, there's a little patch of grassland, maybe a little wetland, a little spot of trees, lots of uncultivated land. So that gives opportunity for those bees now to be nesting, foraging, have more forage resources, have more places to do all the things they need to. So it provides more habitat for longer for more bees, right? So more landscape complexity, definitely better for the bees in that case. So looking at maybe an example of why grasslands are important for bees. So generally, again, this is work taken from Corey Sheffield and Fryer and Dimesh. They're just collected some of the records for bees in Canada and bees in the prairie region. So they found the number of species is actually very high in the grasslands. The number of unique species is high, and the number of oligolectic bees, so groups of bees that are on the spectrum of becoming specialists. So they might be working in all the groups of the aster family or the sunflower family or the willow family. So more groups there in the prairies. So the prairies are very important for bees. So they provide a lot of the habitat. So bees are generally in semi-arid environments. They're nesting mostly in the ground. So the prairies are important for keeping pollinator diversity high and bee diversity high in Saskatchewan and in the world too as well. Look again for a place to bees, for habitat for bees, we need a place to live and overwinter and a place to raise their young. So just a schematic of what maybe the edge of a good field or a habitat for bees might be. So we might have our cropland there, and then we might have some space beside the cropland where we have uncultivated soil and a little bit of bare ground, so the bees can be nesting in there. And then we've got some native shrubs or forages along there, nesting blocks for bees that are nesting in woody material. We've got our old or dead trees where the bees can nest if they're wood-boring trees or wood-boring bees or cavity nesting bees, they can nest in there. They've got some water, they've got some soil space to go in. So all that sort of stuff would be very good for the bees, provide them that opportunity to raise their young and just live their lives, right? So another example, active restoration of pollinator habitat, such as roadside wildflower planting, can significantly increase wild pollinator abundance. So if we look at maybe a habitat or example of where this might be, so this is probably 1,000 different highways in Saskatchewan or across the prairies or across, the prairie provinces or prairie states. It would be a highway corridor, and there's a field on one side of the road, and then there's the utilities there too as well, so power poles. So the farmer here is weaving in and out of those power poles, trying to maximize the cultivation area. But in that case, may not actually be maximizing the pollinator area. So if we know all our bees are nesting in the ground, or a bulk of them are, 70% or so, nesting in the ground, by maximizing the cultivation, we might be minimizing the pollinator habitat. So we maybe change that idea. If we, instead of weaving in between that space, we might just plant pollinator habitat along there, leave some space for, of course, traffic safety, but we could put in that habitat, let the bees nest there, have the forage resources kind of year round, and then the farmer might actually realize some benefit in yield if they've got a flowering crop, and then some also reduce input costs, reduce machinery overlap, reduce fertilizer inputs and all sorts of things for them too as well. So different opportunities there for habitat as well. So in terms of resources for different people or different places, just did a publication up specifically for Saskatchewan on pollinator plants and planting for Saskatchewan. It would have applicability for Manitoba, Alberta, probably the northern states as well, but different applications for where to plant, how to plant, and then a species list. So there's that available. But there is other resources too, places like the Xerxes Society, SaskPCAP has some other resources. There's lots of different resources on pollinators, so there's different opportunities to pull stuff up And if you have any questions, you can get a hold of me or other pollinator experts. I'm sure would be happy to help too. So just a quick look maybe at some of the literature resources. If you want to, I know this is going to be recorded for webinar, you can pull it up, pause it, and look at some other stuff. And then just a quick summary of kind of how all that might work. So our insect pollination can increase fruit set or seed set and quality. Different insects have difference in ability for the pollinating. Grasslands provide high quality pollinator habitat. Diverse habitats allow for diverse pollinator plant interactions. And then landscapes benefit from pollinators. So that's it in a nutshell. There we go. Any questions?
Wow, thanks so much for the fascinating presentation. It was very informative. We have a couple questions here from listeners. A listener named Jade would like to know if you could just go back and repeat a couple of sentences you said about the ASCAP population and how it must be pollinated at the same time by the bee, something along those lines.
Sure. Yes, when you look at our HASCAPs, so there's most of our HASCAPs are, when people plant them, you need a pollinizer. You need at least one plant to provide a different source of pollen. If they're too closely related, they can't produce fertile fruits. They're self-incompatible. So you need the bees to transfer pollen from the pollinizer to the one that you're getting the fruit from. So the bees will be going from row to row. So if you look at the orchard here, there might be one row or maybe one plant in every 4 down that row. So the bee would collect that pollen, she'd go kind of down the row, and as she goes, she'd move that pollen from one place to another and transfer it from the pollinizer to the fruit one. But also to get the full fruit set. So you see in the top left corner there, those two, the one that the bumblebee is on, there's one flower there, but there's also the flower off to the right is of the same fruit. So they join as a little green spot in the center. Both those two sides of that flower have to be pollinated. So if you see that the picture of the fruit there in the bottom second from the right, you can see those two fruit inside. Those are the result from the individual flowers. And then if they both get pollinated, that whole kind of skin should grow down over top of them. So for whatever reason, this one hasn't completely formed that way. So the individual HASCAP flowers have to get pollen from a different plant, but also pollen in both of those flowers to get the proper fruit set. Hopefully that's answered your question. They're flowering at a time of year where it's very early in the season, so our honeybees aren't very active, or it's a little bit too chilly for them. So those bumblebees they've got the face and the morphology, and actually they're big and burly and can keep themselves warm enough to be foraging when those flowers are blooming and take advantage of that, get that nectar for themselves, get the pollen, and then pollinate those flowers too. So.
Perfect, thank you. And our listener says,
Yep.
Thank you for clarifying. She understands now.
Yeah, good.
Lewis would like to know what kind of native bee studies have been done to set baselines. How do you feel our native bees are doing?
Great question. Yeah, native bees is a pretty tough one because they're tough to monitor, right? So if you think of something in terms of, say, larger wildlife, say deer or moose or elk or whatever, they're pretty easy to spot, but and there's lots of people who can identify a moose from a deer from an elk. If we look at our bees, there's lots of different challenges with them. So because there's, in Saskatchewan, 386 species of bees, and I know quite a few species of bee, but I would only be able to guess probably 50 species. So in terms of the experts in the province to tell the difference between them, there's not very many of them in the province. There's not very many of them in Canada. And then to monitor for them, they're tough to spot and tough to monitor for. So some of them might be only active at a short period of time in a year. So maybe 1 week, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. So if you're monitoring, say, in August or June, you might miss the ones that are coming out in July, pardon me. So they're difficult to monitor that way. They also have to, if you're setting up traps and things, collect them there and have someone identify them. So identifying them and getting all the different species down is difficult too. And then through this season, yeah, you're not going to collect them all too. So a little bit challenging there as well. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. Another listener would like to know if non-native bee species like alfalfa leaf-cutting bees have a negative impact on native bees or if they outcompete them.
The research is coming along in that area, and the answer is yes. It's likely. In a given area, there's only so many flowers to go around. So in an area where the bee population is not very dense or low, there's probably lots of flowers to go around. But in an area where there's lots of honeybee colonies or maybe lots of leafcutters, they can be taking resources from wild bees. So in terms of our introduced leafcutter bees, they actually don't forage that far, so they kind of stay where you put them. So in that case, maybe 200 meters or less. So that's why those leafcutter huts are so close together and spaced the way they are. The bees are not really flying much farther than that. So they kind of stay where they go. Our honeybees, they can forage quite a far ways. And if there's lots of colonies in one spot, those colonies, so an individual honeybee colony can collect in Saskatchewan about 200 pounds of nectar a year. So if there's, say, 30 colonies in one spot, 200 pounds of nectar in per colony, a bunch of different colonies, that's a lot of nectar. And if there's other bees around, that's resources they can be kind of pulling up from other places. So they're good in the places where we want them. They do really good, probably in places where there's lots of canola. Our native bees wouldn't be at populations high enough to result in great pollination. But in places where there's less forage resources, maybe better to, it's not probably going to be great for honeybees anyway. They would get some, but maybe better to move them out and leave a little bit of space or have a lower density of introduced bees to allow more resources for all the other native bees. So, yep, great question.
Thanks for that answer. A listener named Ross says, very cool presentation, and he's wondering if you have collaborated on any grazing and multi-species wildlife pollinator research at all.
I haven't, no. So my role with government right now is I haven't done a whole lot of research. I'm trying to connect the dots on research, and I'm relatively new in the role, but that's something I want to pull together different people. And if you have suggestions or different people I could be chatting with. I know I've been in touch with Saskatchewan Forage Association and Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association too, to kind of talk with them and see some of their needs and stuff. So they produce forage for cattle feed, but they also need to produce the seed to produce more forage too. So some of that is available, and then some of the habitat for pollinators is the same for grazing habitat for cattle. So there's definitely opportunity to collaborate, and I'm exploring those kind of slowly as I get pieces in place and people in place that I can chat with and know how to do that. So yep, great question. If you have suggestions, of course, get in touch with me and we can explore that too.
Thanks. A listener named Ross, again, sorry, is wondering if you're familiar with the prairie strips being incorporated into farms in the U.S. He says the USDA is actively promoting prairie grass and flower strips within annual cropping systems. Have you investigated similar concepts here?
Yeah, so there's a few different projects or programs and stuff in the States. I have seen that they're promoting that. I wasn't sure if they were doing strips right in the field, so that's kind of new information to me. I knew they were doing maybe strips along the edges and things, but not in the field, so that's new and interesting. I have kind of looked in different places, so I pulled up some plant lists and look at how different people are doing it. Part of the challenge with building pollinator habitat has been, we know pollinator habitat is good, but we also have to convince the land users that pollinator habitat can benefit them from, increased fruit set or increased seed set or things, but also maybe some other benefits too, like reduced soil erosion, increased water infiltration, all the sort of benefits you get from that habitat too. So getting some of that information out to landowners and things is something I'm exploring and I'm working on too to get that rolling. So yep. That's something that's always on my radar, is getting getting ways or plans to get different pollinator habitat out there, not just for pollinators, but because it actually benefits multiple different aspects of farming and ecosystems. So yeah, great question.
Thanks. Along those same lines, a listener named Daniel is wondering if Saskatchewan agriculture is working with farmers to encourage the maintenance of native grasslands and idle areas on their farms.
Yes, so we do have a few different programs, and I'm not a programs expert, but we do have a few different programs. There's a permanent tame forage program and a permanent native forage program that are kind of to take land out of that's currently in annual crop cultivation that's maybe kind of marginal or poorly used, and put it in there too. Some of the work or some of my suggestions for my pollinator document is to, yeah, there's lots of places on farms that are, pardon me, poorly adapted to seed production. So it's maybe a corner of a field, or it's a wet spot, or it's a high dry spot, or the soil's too coarse, or it's a kind of an awkward field corner. Is to just put in pollinator habitat there and leave it. It would be good for the pollinators, and actually it's probably not going to cost you anything. It might even save you money, or might even make you money. So yep, there's different opportunities for that, and that's something we're working on. And there's a few different programs, again, that native forage program and the tame forage program, to kind of do that. They're not specifically for pollinators, but the pollinators are for sure going to benefit from that. So yep, great question.
Thanks. A listener named PJ would like to know if you could show the link, the link, sorry,
Sure.
the
Yep.
screen with available publications and all the links there. And I would just like
Yep.
to make a note to our listeners. If you'd like, you can press the screenshot button at the top of the webinar. I don't think it works if the webinar is in full screen, but if you minimize it slightly or make it a smaller screen, there's a screenshot, and you can yeah, take a picture of it and then use it again. And it just saves right to the desktop.
Yeah, so if you can't copy down the link or get it quick enough, this is a publication, we call it's Beelines. So if you go to Saskatchewan Agriculture, and you just kind of search Beelines 2020, there should be a link would come up, and this is the document. So it's a document we put out to beekeepers in the province this year. So the first part of it is a honey survey of the beekeepers in the province, but the last part of it is this document here that's got the pollinator planting in Saskatchewan. So it'll have that. It's got kind of where, when, how, and why to plant, and then a good pollinator list. It's about, I think it's about 85 species or so. So there's some grasses, some shrubs, and then forages and things that they're good for pollinators, and a mix of both native and introduced. So gives you options there. If you've got more or less time or money to invest in it, you can get those pollinator plant lists and build up a plant list for your location. So it's built on, there's columns in there that have moisture and then soil zones, so you can kind of pick and choose or tailor make it for your area too, and a little bit on the different plants available. So lots of different resources too, and that's just to start. There's lots of other stuff. If you're looking to get in touch with me or other people, for sure do that, and it would be helpful for you.
Perfect. We have a couple questions about what the public can do to help pollinators. And one of our listeners is wondering, how much do these actions actually help compared to something like large scale diversifying agricultural practices and avoiding non-native monoculture, for example?
Yeah, so that's a pretty good question. I guess it all helps is the easy answer, I suppose. So if you're looking to up your pollinator population in, say, your garden or your backyard or something, that's going to help you and your garden and your flowers around it. So you can do things like leave your grass long, change it to clovers, leave the leaves in the fall, those sorts of kind of relatively simple things. That's going to help on a smaller scale. But if we take those small scale things, we start patching them together now in different places where there's not great pollinator habitat, that's definitely going to help. So those little things add up. So like I said, a small patch of flowers could benefit a small group of pollinators in a local area, but we start adding larger areas. So maybe, like the edge of a road, that's going to provide benefit for, kind of maybe a kilometer around that space. We start patching in all those pieces of road together, and now we've got maybe a network of pollinator habitat that's going to help and boost the pollinators for a larger landscape. So every little bit helps. I mean, it can be daunting to look at a landscape and go, geez, I'm just 1 yard in one spot. But I like to take the positive view that every little bit helps, and adding those bits and pieces together, now patch flowers together, now patch habitats together, make landscapes, make ecosystems, right? So it all helps for sure.
Besides building a bumblebee box and participating in bumblebee watch programs like through apps and stuff and establishing habitat, are there other things that citizen scientists can do to help?
Good question. I guess pollinator habitat is probably the most important thing, right? Without habitat, you don't have pollinator landscape. So if you can, contributions to habitat-based organizations, so Ducks Unlimited, something like that is a very good one. National parks, different places. Talking to a farmer or a landowner, there's some things that are coming in the States and things where you can have, so like an organic certification, you could be getting a bee-friendly certification. It's new and it's coming on slowly, but so that a farm can go through the steps to make, like, so it's kind of an audit process or a trail that says we do this and this with our pesticide use. So we have the least pesticide we can. We're doing eco-friendly things, all sorts, like they're planting pollinator habitat, etc. So this farm is now certified bee-friendly, so that wherever they are, they're boosting the bee population where it is. You can buy those products, pay a bit of a premium, but now the farmer has an incentive or a reason to actually take these little bit of extra measures that sometimes cost a little money, but if they can make some of those costs back, that's a benefit to them too. So consumer choices help. So if you see an opportunity for that, or you see a place to do that, would be good. Habitat, I guess, helps too. So all of it together, I guess, do what you can where you can. And that is definitely good for pollinators. So talk to different landowners and maybe make them aware, or talk to different organizations and things. And maybe put your money where your mouth is and provide some pollinator habitat in your own spot, in your own backyard, and think about different landscapes and where they can be boosted too. So.
Thanks. It's really interesting to know that you can be a responsible consumer. I always think about that for cows and eating grass-fed beef, but or fish, for example. But being a responsible consumer means certified bee friendly. That's really good to know. So thanks for that answer.
Yep.
A listener named Aaron would like to know, could the focus be more toward connecting remnant prairie patches through highway plantings rather than primarily benefiting local agriculture? And is wondering if so, would teaming with the Department of Highways be possible? And believes that Iowa has been doing this for many years to conserve the tall grass species and habitat.
In short, yes, all of that would be great. Yeah, for sure. So that's something I've thought about too. So, like my position is from the agriculture side. So I'm, by function of my job, a little bit biased towards agriculture and seed set, but I definitely do see the benefit of, patching those pieces of landscape or those remnant patches of grassland together. So adding those corridors definitely allows those bees to move, gives them the opportunity to reproduce and live and connect those patches together. So that's definitely good. I haven't had a chance yet to talk to the Department of Highways, but it's something I intend to do in the future. And that's the sort of thing that definitely helps everybody, right? So it helps the pollinators, helps the farmers, helps wildlife, helps endangered wildlife, helps ecosystems. It's just a benefit for everybody. So that's definitely an opportunity to explore for sure. Yeah.
Thanks. I think that's all the questions that oh, sorry. There's one more that just came in there. A listening Barbara would like to know that, or mentions that people are selling mason bee houses for use in urban yards. And what are mason bees? And if you put their houses, how might it benefit your garden or yard? This is actually something I'm thinking about doing, so I'm looking forward to your answer.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I didn't cover mason bees, but so our mason bees are something called a blue orchard bee. You might also see them as called bob. blue orchard bee. They're Osmia lignaria. There's a few different subspecies. There's ones east of the mountains and ones west of the mountains, and I can't remember the subspecies off the top of my head, but there's two different subspecies. So you can actually buy the bee from different places. I probably recommend against maybe moving bees from place to place, but put up the bee nest box will help. It gives them an opportunity for a place to nest. What you need to think about with a mason bee, nest is mason bees are, like they say, a mason. So they need a soil to make their cap. So where we have a leaf cutter bee, they're cutting leaves to make their cocoons. A mason bee is collecting soil or clay or sand or something. So the research is a little bit out on what they prefer, but generally a loam-ish kind of soil. So if you have a wet spot in your garden or a place where you've got opportunity for that, provide them continuously moist or wet soil so they can collect it and form it into the kind of the envelope of their nest. They'll collect it, take it back to their colony, or take it back to the nest block or the nest house, make their tube, and away they go. What you should be careful of if you're doing any sort of thing with bee nesting is cleaning them out or not leaving them just forever, because those places can now become a harbor for disease and parasites. So lots of our bees, basically all of them, have a wild parasite of some kind, usually a wasp, that will come in there, lay an egg in the larva. The larva will hatch, the egg will hatch. It'll eat so it'll either be on top of the larva or it'll be actually in the larva. It'll eat the bee larva and kill it. So if you leave them there unattended for a long time and you don't clean them out, you can actually boost the population of parasites and predators that would come up, and they'd be, after a while, you're a breeding ground for bees, but you're a breeding ground for parasites too. So make sure you clean it kind of every maybe season or every 2 seasons. So the kind of blocks where you can't pull them apart are okay, but they're not the best. If you can clean them apart, pull them apart and clean them every couple of years, that would be better. But yes, they do help, but just use with caution. So don't just set it and forget it. It's kind of set it and maybe maintain it for a little bit. We're looking at. So if you're interested, get a hold of me. There's other resources I can show you about some of that stuff too. It would be helpful to give you some idea on what is entailed with that. So the blue orchard bee, to get to the other part of the question, is it's again kind of an oligolectic bee. So working on a group of flowers, generally the rose family, and things that are blooming early in the season. So like our Saskatoons, our apples, choke cherries, pin cherries, etc. So if you've got orchard or tree fruit in your yard, they fly at a cool temperature. So they're kind of a robust bee. They're shiny and blue, like those big fuzzy flies you see. They're kind of that colored, like a dark blue, metallic blue, very fuzzy, and they pollinate. They're actually more effective per bee on an individual basis than honeybees. So they're, again, that morphology we're talking about, pollinators. They have the right size and shape that they're basically every flower they visit, they pollinate. So they've got the right kind of configuration of hairs in the right spot, and the way that they forage is a little bit better than honeybees, so that they're more effective on a per bee basis. So you can actually, with quite a bit fewer individuals, 10 individuals versus maybe 100 or 1,000 individuals, they result in about the same pollination. So for 20 bees, you can pollinate quite a bit more than you would for maybe 20 bees of honeybees. So very effective kind of for that group of flowers to be pollinators.
Thanks for that answer. I think that's all the time we have for questions today. So with that, thank you so much for coming in when you have a brand new little one at home.
No worries, no worries.
We really, really appreciate you sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience, and bringing it down to a level that people like me can understand.
Sure, yeah.
I wasn't even sure of the difference between all these different bees before, so I really got a lot out of it, and I know our listeners did as well. And we've had quite a few listeners type in and say thanks for the fantastic presentation. information and how cool of a presentation it was. So thank you, Graham. To all of our listeners out there, when you leave the presentation, a quick 1-minute survey will pop up. If you don't mind filling it out, we would really appreciate that, because then we can report back to our funders and keep this event going into the future. And with that, have a great rest of your day, everyone, and happy Wednesday.